as both chair and first speaker for this session. And I want to talk about the ethics of sensors in the home as a way of data collection. And to say that this is a project which is called HomeSense, and with its objectives are to help social researchers use the digital sensors that are now becoming available for the collection of data. If you were at Jane Elliott's talk before coffee, you will perhaps have noticed that I made asked a question which was very much in this vein, that it seemed to me that we should be, as social researchers, using the technologies not just to analyze data, as she was mainly talking about, but also to collect data. And this is what raises ethical issues and what I want to talk about. So this particular project is aiming to make it easier for researchers to use these kinds of digital sensors, and it'll do that by providing guidelines, how to do it book, if you like, and also some examples of actually doing it, bearing in mind the technical, the methodological, and the ethical issues. And of course it's the ethical issues that we're going to be particularly talking about today. So the research has got three strands to it. First of all, adapting and developing sensors and digital devices to collect data. Secondly, to develop data collection methods to use these devices. And thirdly, creating methods for analyzing the data that we collect. And the project has, which is based at the University of Surrey. I'm the PI, and it's a collaboration between us in sociology and the so-called 5G Centre in our Department of Electronic Engineering, 5G being the next after 3G and 4G, and now we're coming up to the development of 5G in mobile phone technologies. And we also have, I'm delighted to say that we also have a link with Microsoft Cambridge, represented by Uwe, who's going to be talking anyway in a moment or two. So what is the project in practice going to do? What we're interested in looking at is activities within the home. We all live in homes, in households, but actually as social researchers it's really quite difficult to find out what goes on inside the home. We have got time use diaries and quite a long tradition now of using time use diaries, which are the kind of thing that you fill in every half hour at the end of a day, specifying what it was that you did in some detail every half hour typically. And that can tell you something, but it is self-evidently rather laborious for the poor respondents to keep writing down what they're doing. We can interview people retrospectively, but a little bit of an experiment. You think yesterday, what were you doing yesterday? What did you do at midday yesterday? Can you remember exactly? It's actually quite hard for people to remember the trivia of every day. So what we are aiming to do is to see whether we can use the new generations of digital sensors to instrument or to monitor households in real time and find out what's going on. So we're in the business of recruiting 20 volunteer households. We're fitting them with sensors, and we're going to have those sensors in those households for 3 months. And in order to find out whether we can actually collect useful data from sensors like this, we will be triangulating with time use diaries, with questionnaires, and with what are called walking interviews. These are interviews in which we take people through their homes, they take us as interviewers through their homes, commenting on what their daily routines are. So our first strand of work, which is what we are doing now, is, I can get this to move, is to adapt and develop and test a range of sensors that would collect the sorts of data that we're interested in. And there are 3 kinds of those. First of all, we have some fixed sensors which collect things like kind of boring physical measurements, temperature, humidity, noise. We don't actually collect sound in the sense of audio, but we do collect noise and detect movement. Then we are developing and testing wearable sensors, the things like, I'll show you one in a moment. The things that you've probably seen in the adverts are Fitbits and things of that kind. And then we are also going to be giving our respondents, our householders, smartphones if they haven't already got one, and putting apps on those, which we will be using to deliver questionnaires, essentially, which they can respond to in real time. How are you feeling at the moment? What did you do today? And other questions of that kind. So look a bit closer look at these. The fixed sensors, we're with the 5G center that I mentioned, developing a box which actually isn't going to look like this. This is a prototype, but we're taking it to an industrial designer, and it will be produced in quantity, and it we won't be see-through like this, but it's the sort of thing that we're hoping that people will put on their mantelpiece, and it has a whole bunch of sensors in it, as you can see. And those sensors transmit data through Wi-Fi to a broadband router, and then back to a server back at base in the university. In addition, we will be fitting these households with energy meters, or energy energy meters that essentially what you do, you can plug these into an ordinary electric socket, plug your fridge or your TV into this gadget, and it will monitor how much energy, how much electricity you're using. So those are the fixed sensors. Then we, as I say, we will be giving all the householders a band that measures their movement. This is the variety that we're using. We've selected this one because it's inconspicuous and cheap, and this also will communicate with their smartphone and will communicate with our server to indicate where they are in the house and what they are moving, or what movement they're generating. So at the moment we're still at the prototype stage, but you can see the sort of dashboard that we have now that will collect. It's probably not too small to see, but you can see that we can collect temperature and movement and humidity and other physical things of that kind. And we can also get data from these wearable devices in a constant stream, which shows you, for example, movements that are made when we can infer when people are asleep and their heart rate and things of that kind. Okay, so I'm not going to go any more into the technology. I just wanted to show you that it's possible to collect this kind of data. It's possible, but as you probably already can imagine, it raises some interesting ethical issues, and so I wanted to spend the rest of my time talking about those. And what I'm going to do is not provide any answers. I'm going to provide a set of headings, if you like, that we need to think about as social researchers in doing this kind of data collection. Informed consent, security, privacy, inferring meaning from these kinds of data, and data protection. I think these are the sorts of issues that we need to consider. And in this session, it would be good to have some kind of discussion and commentary about these. And let's start off with informed consent. Well, it's now a standard requirement that if you're going to collect data from human respondents, informants, that you need their informed consent. And that should surely apply also to the collection of data through these kinds of sensors. That, I think, is not controversial. But actually, it becomes more difficult when we start thinking about what informed consent means in this context. So, okay, as I said, we're going to put these fixed sensors in people's ordinary in their homes. So presumably we need the informed consent of the families, the people who live in those homes. So much is obvious. But what do we do with, for example, children? How do we can't get informed consent from babies. What about teenagers? Do we have an age limit in which of responsibility for informed consent? There's not really very much a track record about how one should negotiate that within a family. What about visitors who come into the household? How do we obtain their informed consent? Remember, we will not be there, so do we delegate the requirement for informed consent to the householders? Or do we, for example, put up a big notice on the front door saying, "Enter here at your peril," because we're collecting data inside this house? Do we need to make a distinction between the friends who come for tea and the delivery man from Amazon? Because those are both visitors to the household. I don't have any good answers to these questions, but I think we need as a community to start thinking about the answers. And you may already have some answers. I've shown you the sort of data that, this kind of dashboard that we will have, sort of collecting these kinds of data. If we're going to have informed consent, well, the informed bit indicates that we need to be able to tell people whose data we are collecting what it is that we're collecting. But the sort of data that we're collecting is quite difficult to understand exactly what we are getting. I can tell you that we, for example, are collecting humidity, the amount of dust in the air. We are collecting noise. But exactly, to what extent do we need to explain the technology to our informants to get their informed consent? Even more problematic, in my view, is if we're having informed consent, then what we are expected to do is to tell our informants what we're going to do with the data. But it's not very clear what one can do with the data as yet. We are, in fact, the project is about finding out what we can do with the data. And so, unlike, for example, asking a survey wherein one has the questions already set out in order for particular research purposes, what we're doing is collecting data for what could be a whole range of potential purposes. How do we explain that? Do we obtain informed consent once and once only at the beginning when we start collecting, or should we be doing this as we go along? There are various reasons for suggesting that it would actually be better if we obtain their consent to be involved, but then went back to them at intervals to remind them about the sorts of things that we are collecting. We're hoping that all of this sensors is going to kind of fade into the background. They won't be affecting them, but on the other side of the coin, if they begin to forget about the sensors, then are they still informed? Are they consenting in an informed way? So again, this raises questions about how explicit we should be in our informed consent, or how implicit it's appropriate to be. Let me move on from informed consent to the issues of security. We want to be sure that if we're collecting data, then somebody else isn't going to tap our data streams. And to do that, we are using a technology which allows us to encrypt what's called end-to-end. So as soon as the data is collected, actually inside that box is an encryption device, and that encryption is only decrypted when we get to the other end of the server. Actually, there's some technical issues about what exactly is being encrypted, which I won't bother you with, but it's important that we not only encrypt the data, but we reassure people that there is encrypted. And a related issue is about data retention. Data protection, the principle of Data Protection Act says that personal data should be retained for the minimum time and then disposed of. RC UK policy says that data should be retained for as long as possible, so that, for example, somebody else, another researcher could come and do a secondary analysis or validate, replicate your analysis. So there's some interesting issues there that I think come up actually in other areas as well. But we need to resolve that as well. Privacy. It's all very well, as you might imagine, we're not going to put people's plain names into the data stream. So we will do the normal sort of thing and have identify households by ID numbers, and we will have the key to those ID numbers secured in a separate place. This is all fairly conventional stuff. But we also should be aware that what we're looking at is our households, which are each one likely to be different from another, and where there is a risk, at least, that one family member may be able to identify another family member, even if we can't do it, because they know them. So there's an issue that we need to think about carefully there. It's like, we're going to be collecting data continuously 24/7 in people's homes, and there may be some things that go on that perhaps they wouldn't be very keen on us knowing about at all. One obvious category of that is sex. An even more difficult one is what happens if we find evidence of domestic abuse, violence. Again, this is something where some social research has got some answers, because this is not the only occasion in which one gets information of this kind. But we need to think in advance about what we would do if we found data that indicated that somebody was abusing somebody else in one of our households. Are we required? Should we ethically report such things? How sure can we be? We are not actually collecting, as I said, audio, or certainly not video. What we are collecting is noise, if you like, and movement. So what might indeed appear to us to be an instance of, for example, violence, might actually be something entirely acceptable, or it might not. I don't know how we quite deal with those sorts of things. We are, in a real sense, collecting personal data, and that means that we have to abide by the Data Protection Act. This is a quote from the Data Protection Office, and the data protection principles. I've outlined in red the ones that seem to be particularly relevant to what we're doing. I put the last one in because although our data will go onto our server, we need to be careful that it isn't exported to, say, Google Drive or Dropbox, because that is external to the country. Okay, so I've sketched out some of the questions for which I don't have any answers, but you may. Why is all of this important? Well, for the very pragmatic reason that we have to get ethical approval to engage in the research in the first place. We have to abide by legal constraints, and perhaps most important, we need to obtain the trust and cooperation of our households, and they're going to be asking us about these kinds of issues, or at least they ought to be asking us about these kinds of issues, and that means that we need to have answers ready. We've begun to think about the answers, but I would be the first to admit that we've got a long way to go. Security, I mentioned end-to-end encryption. Consent, we want to think about ways of obtaining what I call incremental consent, as well as the initial formal one, so that we remind people, perhaps on their smartphone, that we are doing things, we're collecting data. Privacy, well, we will need to allow householders to switch off the sensors, not wear the mobile bands and so on. And we need to be careful about data protection. We're aiming to recruit households and to start collecting the data in the autumn of this year, so we need to have some answers to those questions by then. We're starting to collect data and to develop data analysis methods. One of the things about this is, in terms of Jane's prior lecture, this is going to be generating big data. We're expecting to collect 165 gigabytes we calculated of data to analyze. And we shall be producing a draft of our methodological and ethical guidelines as part of the project. So I hope that that gives us an introduction to the sorts of issues that we need to think through. And I'm happy to answer questions, but I'll be happy to hear from our next two speakers about their experiences of these sorts of things and the kinds of issues that they think that we ought to be considering.